The last anyone saw of them, they were children excited about Christmas. Maurice was 14. Martha, 12. Louis, 9. Jennie, 8. And Betty, the youngest, was 5 years old. They went to sleep on Christmas Eve 1945 in a house in West Virginia. And by Christmas morning, they were gone. Not found dead in the wreckage. Not recovered. Not buried. Gone. 5 children. No remains. No explanation that has ever fully held up. And a family that spent the rest of their lives, decades, all the way to 1989, all the way to 2021, convinced that their children had not died that night. Convinced that they had been taken. This is the story of the Sodder children. And I want to tell it to you carefully. Because the facts alone are disturbing enough, and there are enough of them, stacking on top of each other, that by the time we're done I want you to tell me where you land. Because I genuinely don't know where I land. Let's get into it. Hi guys, welcome back. Okay, so I need to give you some context before we get to Christmas Eve. Because George and Jennie Sodder, the parents at the center of this story, were not ordinary people in the sense of being without enemies or history. They were ordinary people in every other sense. They were a family. A big, close, working family in a small Appalachian town. But they had made someone angry. And that anger may, or may not, have something to do with what happened. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Sardinia, Italy, in 1895. He immigrated to the United States in 1908 when he was 13 years old, alone, essentially, and built a life in West Virginia through sheer persistence. He worked on the railroads in Pennsylvania. He drove trucks. He eventually started his own coal trucking company in Fayetteville, West Virginia, which by 1945 had made him one of the more respected men in the community. He and his wife Jennie, also of Italian heritage, had 10 children together between 1923 and 1943. 10 children. The oldest, Joseph, was away in the army when everything happened. The remaining 9 were home that Christmas Eve. Now, Fayetteville in 1945 had a significant Italian immigrant community. And in October 1945, just 2 months before the fire, something unusual happened. An insurance salesman came to the Sodder house. He tried to sell George a life insurance policy. George declined. The salesman became angry, disproportionately, disturbingly angry. He told George, according to multiple accounts, that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. The stated reason? George Sodder's outspoken criticism of Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator who had been killed by partisans just months earlier, in April 1945. The Italian-American community in Fayetteville was divided on Mussolini. George was not. He had said so, publicly and repeatedly. A few months before the insurance salesman's visit, a stranger had come to the Sodder home looking for hauling work. While he was there, he wandered to the back of the house, examined the fuse boxes, and remarked, unprompted, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George found this odd, because the local power company had recently inspected the electrical system and given it a clean assessment. And in the weeks before Christmas, a car with unfamiliar occupants had been seen parked near the school, apparently watching the younger Sodder children as they came and went. None of this proved anything. At the time, it was a collection of uncomfortable moments. The kind of thing you notice and then let go of, because what else are you going to do? George and Jennie let it go. Christmas Eve 1945. The Sodder house 2 miles north of Fayetteville. The older boys, John, 23, and George Jr., 16, had spent the day working with their father and went to bed early, exhausted. George Sr. went to bed too. But the younger children were allowed to stay up a little later. Marion, the oldest daughter at 17, had been working at a dime store downtown and had brought Christmas presents home for her younger sisters. The girls, Martha, Jennie, Betty, were excited about their new toys. Maurice and Louis, the older of the missing boys, were still up too, and Jennie told them they could stay up as long as they remembered to bring in the cows and feed the chickens before bed. Jennie herself went upstairs around 10 with little Sylvia, the youngest, who was 2 years old. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, the phone rang. Jennie went downstairs to answer it. A woman was on the line, asking for someone Jennie didn't know. Strange laugh in her voice. The sound of glasses clinking in the background, like a party. Jennie told her it was the wrong number and hung up. She was on her way back upstairs when she noticed something. All the downstairs lights were still on. The front door was unlocked. The curtains were open. She turned off the lights, locked the door, closed the curtains. She went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, around 1 a.m., she was jolted awake by a loud thud. Something had landed on the roof above her. She heard it roll. Then a second thud as it hit the ground. She didn't get up this time. She thought it was odd. She fell back asleep. And then she smelled the smoke. Jennie came downstairs to find her husband's office completely engulfed in flames. The fire was moving fast, too fast. She screamed for George. The two of them grabbed 2-year-old Sylvia. Marion, John, and George Jr. managed to get out, George Jr. and John singing their hair on the way through the smoke, but alive. Sylvia, Marion, John, George Jr., 4 children out. But the staircase to the upper floor was already fully on fire. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty. They were up there. George ran outside and looked for the ladder he always kept leaning against the side of the house. It wasn't there. It had been moved, later found on an embankment some distance away. He tried to climb up anyway, to reach the second-floor window. He broke the glass. He cut his arm deeply trying to get through. The fire drove him back. He ran to the other side of the house. His 2 vehicles, the trucks he used for his hauling business, were parked outside. He tried to start them. Neither would start. Both vehicles. On the same night. He would later say he had never had trouble starting either of them before. He ran a quarter mile to a neighbor's house. Marion had already run to a different neighbor and tried to call the fire department. No operator answered. Another neighbor tried from their own house. Nothing. The phone lines weren't working. By the time the fire department was reached and trucks were dispatched, it was 8 o'clock in the morning. 7 hours after the fire started. The fire station was 2.5 miles from the Sodder house. The house was gone. Reduced to ash and rubble in approximately 45 minutes from start to finish. And the 5 children were nowhere. Now this is where things stop being a tragedy and start being something harder to categorize. In the rubble and ash, investigators searched for remains. Any remains. You don't need much, a tooth, a fragment of bone, a recognizable piece of anything. 5 children had supposedly burned in that house. Any fire forensic expert will tell you that even a fire of significant intensity and duration leaves bone fragments. The human skeleton does not simply disappear. In fact, Jennie Sodder later spoke to an employee at a crematorium who explained it this way: even bodies cremated at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours still leave bones. The Sodder house burned to the ground in approximately 45 minutes. No remains were found. Death certificates were issued on December 30, 1945, 5 days after the fire. The cause of death listed: fire or suffocation. The cause of the fire: faulty electrical wiring. The coroner's office had issued 5 death certificates for 5 children whose remains had not been found. And then the questions started to accumulate. The fire marshal attributed the blaze to faulty electrical wiring. But during the early moments of the fire, before it spread to the upper floors, the downstairs Christmas lights were still on. If the fire had started because of an electrical fault, the power should have gone out. The lights stayed on. A telephone repairman came to restore the Sodders' phone service after the fire. He examined the line and told them something that changed everything. The line had not been burned through, as they had assumed. It had been cut. Deliberately. Someone had climbed 14 feet up the telephone pole and reached 2 feet out to cut the line, and had done so cleanly, the way you cut something you know how to cut. This was not fire damage. This was not accident. The man who had been seen stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property on the night of the fire was eventually identified and arrested for the theft. He admitted to the theft. He also admitted, under questioning, that he had cut the telephone line, claiming he thought it was a power line. He denied any involvement in the fire. He was never charged with arson. He was never charged with anything connected to the children. The ladder that George had been unable to find was recovered from an embankment away from the house. Neither of George's vehicles ever started again without issue. The fire chief, who was also, notably, the local funeral director, later stated that he believed some bones had been found in the rubble. He produced what he said was a box of burned liver as evidence of human remains. Jennie Sodder, who had seen the box, said it contained what looked like a beef liver, and had no signs of fire damage. Later reports suggested that the fire chief may have placed the box in the rubble himself. Why he might have done this has never been explained. The box disappeared. Bone fragments were eventually recovered from the site and sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The Smithsonian's report came back. The fragments were from a person aged between 16 and 22. Not consistent with the 5 missing children, who ranged from 5 to 14. And critically, the fragments showed no signs of having been exposed to an intense fire. They appeared to have come from somewhere else. The fragments subsequently disappeared from the chain of custody. They cannot be retested today. George and Jennie Sodder did not accept what they had been told. They could not. And the more they looked, the more they pulled at the threads of that night, the more threads came loose. Jennie had watched the windows of the burning house from outside. She had watched carefully, frantically, hoping to see any of her children appearing at the glass. She later said she never saw a single child at a window. Not one face. Not one hand. Children trapped in a burning building will go to the windows. They will scream. They will try to break the glass. Jennie saw and heard none of it. Marion, the oldest daughter, said the same thing. "I never smelled burning flesh," she told a reporter in 1976. "They say you can smell burning flesh miles away, but I never did." Then there was the account from a bus driver who traveled through Fayetteville on Christmas Eve, late, after midnight. He said he had seen people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house. This was consistent with something else, a small, hard, dark green rubber ball-like object that 2-year-old Sylvia found in the brush near the house after the snow melted in spring. George described it as resembling a pineapple hand grenade or other incendiary device. Nobody could identify it definitively. It, too, disappeared. The West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950. At the conclusion of the hearings, the governor and the state police superintendent told the Sodder family that the case was hopeless and closed it at the state level. George wrote to the FBI. Director J. Edgar Hoover personally responded, declining jurisdiction, calling it a matter of local character. The family put up a billboard. In 1952, George and Jennie erected a large billboard on Route 16, at the site where their house had stood. It bore the photographs of the 5 missing children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, their names, their ages, their faces. In large letters across the billboard were the words, "What was their fate, kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive?" A reward was offered. $5,000, soon doubled to $10,000. For decades, anyone driving through Fayetteville could not miss the billboard. The faces of 5 dark-haired, serious-eyed children looking out at the road. For decades it stood. George traveled the country following leads. A woman in St. Louis wrote to say that the oldest girl, Martha, was living in a convent there. A bartender in Texas claimed to have overheard a conversation about the fire and the kidnapping. Someone in Florida said the children were with a distant relative of Jennie's. George investigated every lead he could. He always came home without answers. And then, in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jennie went to collect the mail. There was an envelope addressed only to her. No return address. The postmark was from a city in Kentucky. Inside was a photograph. A young man, mid-20s. Dark curly hair. Dark brown eyes. Strong straight nose. And, this is the detail that undid George and Jennie Sodder completely, the same upward tilt of the left eyebrow. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting nobody has ever identified, were these words, Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. Louis had been 9 years old when the fire happened. A man in his mid-20s in 1968 would be the right age. George and Jennie hired another private investigator. They sent him to Kentucky to find the sender. He disappeared. They never heard from him again. They were afraid that if they made the postmark public, if they named the city, whoever had sent the photograph might be found and harmed, or whoever had sent it might disappear. So they kept the city private. Instead, they had the photograph added to the billboard. The updated image of an adult Louis Sodder, alongside the childhood photographs of the other 4. George Sodder died in 1969. He was 73 years old. He died not knowing what had happened to his children. He had told a reporter the year before, "Time is running out for us. But we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." After his death, Jennie erected a fence around her property and began adding rooms to her house, building, people said, layers between herself and the outside. She had worn nothing but black since the night of the fire, as a sign of mourning. She wore black until the day she died, in 1989. The billboard finally came down after her death. The case has never been resolved. The most thorough analyses of the available evidence tend to conclude one of 2 things, and the evidence supports both in different ways. The first, the 5 children died in the fire. The house burned fast and hot enough, perhaps aided by an incendiary device, perhaps not, to destroy biological remains in ways that the initial search failed to detect or document properly. The strange events before and during the fire, the missing ladder, the cut phone line, the vehicles that wouldn't start, may have been coincidences, or the work of local opportunists who had nothing to do with the children's fate, or the result of the confused and terrified memories of people trying to understand something that had no explanation. The second, the children were taken. By who, to where, for what purpose, remains unknown. The cut phone line was deliberate. The missing ladder was deliberate. The vehicles failing to start was sabotage. The fire was set to create cover for a kidnapping, possibly connected to George Sodder's political enemies, possibly connected to organized crime, possibly connected to something that has never been identified. The children were alive after the fire. The photograph of Louis in 1968 was real. And they were somewhere, living lives they had not chosen, with identities that had been given to them by someone else. Both of these are possible. Neither can be proven. What cannot be argued is this: 5 children went to sleep on Christmas Eve in 1945 and were never seen again. Their mother wore black for 44 years. Their father drove across the country chasing leads until he died. Their youngest sister, Sylvia, who was 2 years old the night of the fire, who called it her earliest memory, maintained until her death in 2021 that her siblings had survived. The memorial garden where the house stood is still there. The site of the billboard is still there, though the billboard is long gone. The case is technically still open. And no one has ever been charged with anything. Okay guys. That is the story of the Sodder children. 5 kids. One Christmas Eve. A fire that burned a house to ash in 45 minutes. And no remains. No answers. No resolution. I've told you the facts as carefully as I can. Now I want to know what you think. Do you believe the children died in the fire? Or do you think something else happened that night in Fayetteville, West Virginia? And what do you make of the photograph, the 1968 letter from Kentucky, the man with the upward tilt of the left eyebrow? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And this is one of those stories where I am genuinely, sincerely uncertain, and where what you think might be the thing that shapes how I think about it going forward. If this video was worth your time, please hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications. And I'll see you in the next one.